Hey lovelings, here's the video I was too scared to make for 10 years for reasons that now seem incredibly stupid to me. If you know me, you know that for a long time I strongly identified with being a cult survivor. That was because I was born and raised into a very, very, very suffocating church environment where I was on the inner circle. I was the pastor's goddaughter and I was exploited for money there. And after that, I found myself sort of having fallen into a mentor-mentee relationship with my best friend's cousin, who I call Arachne. So for all intents and purposes, in the past I've called her my cult leader, my one-on-one cult leader. And a big reason I've stopped writing for my Unminding project, which was always intended to be a cult recovery resource, is because I've secretly been having a slow and steady series of epiphanies that have led me to see Arachne very differently than I have described her in the past. I still think that she was abusive and was definitely not careful with the influence that she had over me, especially as someone who was socially subordinate to her in age, in experience. But I have reached a new understanding of her, of what motivates her. I no longer feel victimized by her, but instead now I appreciate the role that she played in my life, in my development, and the role she played in the night that saved my life. And that is the story I'm going to be telling tonight. I know that's a big bombshell, and a big reason I held back from explaining to everyone why I was kind of like avoiding YouTube and the Unminding blog was because I didn't want to hurt my audience. I speak to people regularly who are so severely damaged and traumatized from spiritual leaders, self-styled gurus who just take advantage of them and exploit them, and I am very sensitive to that fact. I know it firsthand what it's like to be traumatized in that way, in that subtle way that doesn't leave bruises, and so it's harder to find people who understand and sympathize with you. All of that said, I can no longer allow my fear of hurting other people's feelings or collapsing other people's perceptions of their own trauma to stop me from talking about my truth. And my truth is that everything I used to fear about Arachne, I realize we had in common. How do I say that better? I have come to accept that I do believe she was, in fact, very spiritually gifted. She was not simply a manipulator. She was not lying about every single thing that she was capable of. I do think she was profoundly spiritually advanced. And her gifts, I think, were very confusing to her, and her confusion spilled over onto me. Unfortunately, I forgive that now. I forgive myself for being in that situation now, and I have also come to accept that I am also very spiritually gifted. And for the better part of my 27 years of life, I have tried so hard to suppress that in myself. I have essentially been running away from myself, myself being a very deeply spiritual being, and I'm not gonna do that anymore. I'm tired of cutting myself in half and putting my spiritual self and my interest in the paranormal and the occult and psychic phenomenon over here and presenting a different face to everyone else so that I won't be labeled crazy, so that I won't be looked at funny, and I no longer care. I no longer care, and it's the most freeing thing ever. And so I want to share some of the joy of having that realization by telling you about the night that literally saved my life and that has haunted me to this day, because that experience made it so clear to me that we are all spiritual beings. And so few of us remember, because that awareness has been hidden from us, it's been beaten out of us, it's been brainwashed out of us on a societal level. And I don't mean to get all like, oh, the Great Awakening on us, but it is my hope in making this that any of you who are on the fence and who are in denial about your spiritual gifts, your spiritual awareness, your desire to seek truth and seek God, whatever that means to you, I hope that this will shake you out of your slumber and make you realize it's okay. It's okay. So, where do I start? So this is all going to be about the night that I had the most profound spiritual experience I've ever had, which I later came to call a drug-free DMT experience. So it all started when I was 16. I inexplicably developed, I mean, quite literally out of the blue, I don't know where this thought came from. I was very much sheltered from worldviews that are anywhere close to this, so it did feel like it spontaneously came up in me, and it was not an idea that was like implanted in me from an outside influence. Basically, I suddenly came down with this idea that my body was a flesh prison and my soul was trying to escape it, and I felt trapped inside my material body. It was like this painful awareness of having a soul like gripped me to the point where I somehow arrived at this illogical conclusion that the way out of my flesh cage was to starve myself. So this turned into a full-blown eating disorder. Now that's the part I never tell anyone about the eating disorder. I tell people I was concerned about my weight, or it was triggered by vegetarianism, both of which were factors for sure. But the main motive behind me almost starving myself to death was this weird sense that I was so much bigger than my body, and my body was limiting me, and it was like a prison to me. I guess you could say that was me kind of becoming spiritually aware and having no reference point for it because of the stifling environment of the church growing up. Had no framework with which to understand what these feelings were and how to curb them, how to maintain or, manage them. So started starving myself. It got worse and worse and worse. I got underweight. My doctors were thinking of putting me in the hospital. And around this time, I've talked about this in other videos, my best friend at the time, Celine, she found out about my eating disorder, and she invited me to stay over at her place for a week. And her cousin, Arachne, that's what I call her, also found out and suddenly wanted to be there for me, support me emotionally. I used to look at that as predatory. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe she did have good intentions. I don't know. I'll leave that up to you guys because your guess is as good as mine. In that week that I was at Celine's house, there were 2 nights in which Arachne came over. The first night she came over, she told a bunch of stories. Now, there was something very special about Arachne, that she just had this incredible aura. She was high octane. She had immense energy. She commanded space when she walked into a room. Highly charismatic, just abundant energy, just pouring out of her at all times. And that was very attractive to me. I just wanted to know her. I wanted to know what she was about. I could sense that she was very spiritually aware and gifted. And me being like a closet mystic myself, I really, really, really wanted someone who understood me on that level. And honestly, I think she wanted the same thing, which is part of why we became so important to each other. She came over and she did her thing where she narcissistically, basically dominated the conversation all night, talking about all these mystical experiences that she'd had and supernatural occurrences, strange meetings with people who would then disappear right after talking to her, and they'd impart this universal wisdom to her, bizarre stuff. And she told a lot of stories, and all of them, I was one part's mystified, one part's like, yeah, sure. But then she told one story. Well, actually, it was like a group of stories all centering around the same entity. I don't want to say person, like humanoid entity. Okay, to this day, I will only describe this entity to trusted friends or fellow psychic people. I don't want to go there. I don't want to say too much. There are consequences for saying too much about these entities. I know that sounds cryptic and very dissatisfying to those of you who are into this kind of stuff, but this is for my personal safety. I'd rather not say too much. Basically, did I just swallow a fly? So basically, Arachne started telling us these stories of certain incidents that happened during her college years. All of these incidents revolved around a certain humanoid entity that would appear and kind of terrorize her and her friends in this weird, indirect, creepy way. Almost like he was sending her a message or like threatening her with his presence, and then mysteriously disappear. As soon as she would describe this entity, because they looked human, but you know, I would later find out that they are not. As soon as she would even describe his physicality, his mannerisms, his way of talking, or even say his nickname that she had given him, just the worst chills would hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt afraid of this entity, and I felt like I knew him. I felt like she was describing a long lost memory of mine. I felt like just this crazy like fear, like I had already encountered this person before, but I couldn't place where or how and why I didn't remember them, but they felt so familiar. So out of all the stories Arachne told that night, that was the one that struck something in me, struck me like in the bones. Like, I need to know who this person or thing is. And so, and I was not the only person who felt that way. There was one other person there hanging out with us, one of Celine's friends, who got the same exact feeling, and he started tearing up like I did, and he was like, I don't know how, but I feel like I know him. And so Arachne, who loved to be cryptic and, you know, hold information over people's heads, like, I know something you don't know, she just said, yeah, a lot of people know him but don't know that they know him. And that was not satisfying to me. I was like, yeah, well, I need to know how I know him, because suddenly something about this felt like life or death to me. Like, it struck me. It struck me in a way that I can't explain. It's like, it was more intense than a past life feeling. I know some people like to say, oh, I knew as soon as I met you that I knew you from a past life, and it's kind of mystical and cool. This was like that, but worse. It was like, it was like a traumatic memory had been unearthed, if that makes sense. Me and this guy, we started kind of demanding that Arachne tell us, like, how do we know him? Like, where does he come from? And when I asked, where does he come from, I was thinking more like, have I seen this character in a movie? Have I read about him in a book? Like, where am I vaguely remembering him from? But instead of answering the question, where did he come from, Arachne took a piece of paper and drew 2 dots on it, like this. And she said to me and this guy, how do you get from point A to point B? So the guy said, you draw a straight line. And she said, okay. And then I took the paper from her and I folded it over to make the 2 dots meet, like that. And she looked at me like she was proud of me, like she had been testing us with a riddle, and I had passed her test. So she said, that is a really interesting answer, CJ. And then I said, well, what's your answer? How do you get from point A to point B? And she said, you never left. That will all make sense when you keep listening to the rest of the story. So, you know, I don't know how we managed to change that subject, but, you know, the rest of the night went on. She told other stories, but I could not get that one story out of my head. Like, who is this weird entity she kept describing? And why does he creep me the fuck out? So that night, I, like, asked Celine after Arachne went home, like, what the fuck? Like, who is this? And why does it bother me so much? And she said, I can't really say anything. I'll ask Arachne to show you tomorrow. So Arachne came over the next night, whatever, we had some fun, we did a photo shoot, and then it was me, Arachne, alone in Celine's room, and I started opening up to Arachne about my eating disorder. And she was very comforting, very emotionally supportive. And then Celine came back into the room and basically was like, okay, Arachne, are you going to show her? So we were both sitting on the floor, cross-legged. Arachne puts out her hands in front of her, like this, towards me, and says, give me your hands. So I gave her my hands, and she said, close your eyes. So I closed my eyes. And she said, what do you feel? And I could feel, like, through my palms, which she was holding, I felt like a channel of energy open up between us. So we were a circuit now. And I felt her pour her energy into my body. So I felt it streaming, like, up my wrists and up my arms and into the rest of my body, and it spread throughout my body the way blood flows through your body. But this energy she was sending me from her hands was cold, fluid electricity. Like this just cold blue-white electric light that was liquidy. I don't know how to explain it. It was the most specific feeling ever, and I have come to call this her energetic signature because I have since felt that energy in other experiences with her. So sends this energy into my body, and I describe it to her. I say, I feel energy coming out of your hands, going into my hands. I feel the energy going throughout my body. The energy filled up my body so much that it was so cold that I started convulsing. Like, it was icy. Like, my whole body temperature dropped significantly, and I was just shaking and shuddering and stuttering. Like the way that when you're physically cold, you start stuttering. And she said, okay, now go deeper. And somehow, instinctually, I knew what she meant by that. So just this sort of spiritual instinct took over, and somehow, using my energetic body, I gathered up all the energy she was giving me, and I pushed it downward inside of my energetic self. And when I did that, it was like this sort of depth opened up in me, and suddenly everything, with my eyes closed, everything became black. Like, pitch black. The way that, you know, how you normally close your eyes and you can still see, like, some colors, like rods and cone activity going on. Couldn't see any of that. It was pitch black. Something, like, I was sitting in the void inside of myself, if that makes sense. And then she said again, go deeper. So she said that a number of times, and every time she would say go deeper, I would again repeat that process of kind of collecting all the energy and pushing it downward. And then I'd open up more and more and more sort of depths, dimensions within myself. And simultaneously, whenever I would feel myself sort of like expanding downward, my head, my energetic head, was also expanding outward and upward. So on an energetic level, my head was like rushing upward. I was expanding on every level, like beyond the house, beyond the sky. My head felt so big I could no longer sense where its limit was. Like, it was as if my head just blew open. And I'm getting bigger and deeper, and the energy's more intense and more cold, and it's coursing through me so intensely, like a waterfall rushing inside of me, that I'm shaking and I'm convulsing and I'm stuttering, and like, I've never felt energy this intense. Never. Never, never, not even close. Not on my best meditation days, not on drugs, like never. At some point in this blackness that I'm staring at, I start to see this electric, like purple, jaggedy outline, like right here. And it's like not a specific shape, it's just like an outline, I don't know. And it's bright purple. And I tell her that I see like a bright purple outline. And mind you, I had never heard of what a third eye is. I was so sheltered at this point in my life. I was straight out of the church. Like, I'd never encountered Eastern mysticism before. So the fact that I saw my third eye before even knowing what a third eye was, you know, kind of like lends some credibility to everything that happened that night. So I see it, and I start to get the sense that it's like a portal. So I like go through it, and mind you, I'm physically sitting there shuddering and shaking like a crazy woman on Celine's bedroom floor. But on an energetic level, I am way beyond my body. Like the limitations of my body don't make any sense anymore. It's like a gateway has opened inside of myself, and suddenly I go where I want by deciding to go there with my consciousness, if that makes sense. Like, so when I saw this purple outline, it wasn't like I had to physically move into it. I just decided I'm gonna bring my awareness past that outline. And so I go through it just using my awareness, and suddenly I'm in outer space. Like, suddenly it's as if there's this IMAX screen behind my eyelids. Hyper clear detail in my most vivid dreams, in my most vivid moments of being high on weed, because that's the only drug I've done. I've never had that crystal clarity in any other context of my life. I can't begin to explain to you how crystal clear, like diamond clear, this vision was. So I'm sitting there bewildered, shaking, cold, scared out of my mind. What is going on? I don't remember how I got here. Everything's happening so fast. And I'll say that the whole experience lasted maybe 10 minutes total, maybe 15 minutes. She can see that I'm overwhelmed, so she says, all right, open your eyes. So I open my eyes, and I physically can see and feel that I'm in Celine's bedroom again. And Arachne, her eyes look so serene and blissful and calm, and she just looks at me like, take a deep breath. So I take a deep breath, and she says, okay, close your eyes again. As soon as I close my eyes, the IMAX screen was back, like seamlessly. So let me say right now before I forget, this is why I don't believe I was drugged, because that is a fair question. Some people ask when I share this experience. They're like, how do you know she didn't drug you? Because this was not a typical experience where everything's kaleidoscopic and psychedelic and stuff. It was only when I closed my eyes that I would see, you know, these visions of outer space. And then as soon as I would open my physical eyes, I'd be physically back in the room. So I see outer space, and it was like, to be really honest with you, it was like there were 3 parts of this vision. The first was just outer space, and I don't remember the colors exactly. I just remember it being space, and I think I saw a planet in the background, but I wasn't really processing what was in the background, because the first thing I saw in outer space was this like grid of little weird animals. And again, I had never heard of DMT. I had never heard of the machine elves, the clockwork elves. I didn't know what I was looking at. I just knew that in like this grid formation, there were a bunch of little tiny compact animals. Oh God, this is so weird. They were compact, like stumpy little animals, and their bodies were facing this way, but their heads were facing this way. So, like, they were all, like, on all fours, facing that way, but their heads were like that, looking at me. And all of them had strange eyes and clothes. Like, they had clothes on, these little weird elves. So, not a single one of them looked like any animal I have seen on Earth. I do, like, because there was a grid of maybe 20 of them, I wasn't exactly counting. I couldn't make sense of anything I was seeing. I think I recall one of them having horns, and like I think I remember thinking, oh, that's like a billy goat. Like one of them had a beard and kind of like goat eyes, and he was wearing green. But that's all I remember from that grid of animals. Like, I didn't catch the details of any of the others. So I said out loud to Arachne and Celine, like, oh, I see a bunch of funny little animals. And they look like chimeras. Like, I think I chose the word chimeras because I got the sense that they were assembled from parts of different animals. Like, that was the closest I could get to explaining how they looked, because they didn't really look like anything comparable on Earth. Again, I made the decision to take my point of consciousness and move past them. So I moved past them, and when I did, one of them came back. Just one of them came back and came in front of me. And so one of them was just staring at me in that same position, where body facing this way, head this way. And its eyes were like big eyes with like the pupils going this way, like slits, vertical slits in its eyes. And that sounds creepy. The best I can describe what this one looked like was like a capuchin monkey. Like, it was black and white with a little muzzle, and it had a red little dome hat on and a red like blazer. This is so weird. And it was just looking at me, and it looked creepy with the eyes, but I didn't feel creeped out by it, and I couldn't get a read of what it was feeling towards me or thinking about me. But my assumption when I looked at it was that it was curious about me, that it was like, who's this and why is she here? You know, so I couldn't sense danger. I couldn't sense a motive for why this one came back to look at me again. But after I looked at it some more and couldn't really figure out what it wanted, I just decided I'm gonna move past it. So I took my point of consciousness and I just kind of propelled myself past it. Because there were a few moments throughout this experience where Arachne, you know, because she was scared that I was like losing it because I was breathing so hard and trembling so hard, she would ask me on occasion, you know, open your eyes, take a deep breath, remember to keep breathing. I got the sense that she had done this before with other people, like kind of like made them access gateways through themselves. Like, because the way she was guiding me through it was like she had had experience with it before for herself or with other people. So she just kind of talked me through it like a pro. And so because of all these breaks where she would ask me to open my eyes and, you know, I'd see the bedroom again and everything would be normal, I can't remember exactly how I transitioned from seeing those little chimeras or elves or whatever you want to call them to seeing what I saw next. But basically, I somehow transitioned to seeing the planet, and that's what we call it. I don't know the name of this planet. I don't know where it is in terms of like space coordinates. I don't know how to get there, again, to be honest with you. I have tried. This is the one time I went there and opened that gateway within myself, and I have not repeated that experience since. All I know is when I saw it, I got the sense that this was the answer to my question of like, where do those strange entities from Arachne's stories come from? So the answer I got was, this is their home planet. When I saw it, it looked really familiar. And I don't know what to make of that. But basically, so in this IMAX screen of my inner vision, I see a planet that's like very, very, very pale, dusty colored blue. and it's taking up the lower quadrant of my IMAX screen. As a matter of fact, let me use the phone screen to illustrate. So actually, how are you gonna see this video? Because in my vision, it was on my right side that the planet was taking up like this corner of the frame of my eyes, of what I could see in my inner vision. It was pale blue, and in the background was like hot pink outer space with a bunch of stars. I don't know why hot pink. It just was like a space pink. Like, you've all seen like kind of pink galaxies before. It was like that kind of pink. And yeah, so it was like as soon as I reached this place where I was seeing this planet and that old question of mine had been answered, suddenly I calmed down. Like, suddenly all this rushing energy inside of my body wasn't overwhelming to me anymore. I reached this kind of stasis where I had adjusted to this profound experience I was having. And I wasn't scared, I wasn't shaking and crying and trembling anymore. But, you know, so I stare at it for a few minutes because it's really pretty. Like, it's a beautiful, I don't know if you can imagine what it's like to open a gateway of energy inside of yourself and use it as a portal to start viewing, remote viewing outer space inside of your own body, but if you can imagine something like that, then you can imagine why I just sat there stupefied, like, wow, it's so pretty, for maybe a hot minute. Arachne very patiently just kind of waited and let me bask in it. And then as I was staring at it, the colors, you know, the hot pink background of outer space started developing new colors. Like, if you've ever seen the kind of like furnaces where stars are born, it was like that. Like, these swirling colors started appearing, and it was like orange and yellow and like just vivid bright colors, and they were swirling and twirling and dancing around, and it was just so incredibly beautiful. It was all here inside of me. Like, outer space was inner space. I don't know how to make that as profound for you as a listener as it was to me as a 105-pound, sad, pathetic, passively suicidal 16-year-old. Or I had just turned 17 at that time. But yeah, it was incredible, and I was just wordless staring at it, and suddenly it occurred to me that this was no longer about the entities. This was no longer about figuring out who these entities were, where they had come from. Suddenly I had this moment where I realized I was looking at myself. All this beauty I was seeing was me. And it hit me like nothing has ever hit me in my life. It hit me what a disgusting, awful, unforgivable thing it was to starve myself. It just, I understood how absolutely and utterly horrifying and violating of myself, the grandness of myself, it was to just harm myself, you know, to live in misery and deny myself basic nourishment. And it, like, hit me like a fucking train. And I crumbled. Like, I collapsed and I sobbed. It's so beautiful. Why am I torturing it? I guess that's when Arachne decided the experience should be over because it turned into something it had not originally been intended for. And, you know, she said, all right, it's time for you to come out. This might jar you, but I'm going to let go of your hands. And so she let go of my hands and told me to open my eyes, and so I did. Suddenly, I'm just back in Celine's room, and Arachne's sitting in front of me. And this is what she said, ready? She said, and to think, all I had to do was hold your hands. And I hated her for that. I hated her for that because it seemed so obvious to me that she had, in fact, at least catalyzed the experience, if not controlled the experience, because she was the one providing all the energy to me to fuel this, like, inner journey. And it took me 10 years, my friends. 10 years to realize she was telling the truth. She wasn't just fucking with me. This wasn't just one of her silly riddle games where she manipulates words and has fun, like, waving information over people's heads. Like, she was being serious. All she did was hold my hands. And I took myself to outer space. And I think the reason I was in denial about that for so long was because, like, again, it just sounds so stupid now, but I identified so strongly with my trauma, and, you know, my formative years were spent in this suffocating church where any sort of spiritual pursuit outside of what they deemed acceptable was straight up demonic, satanic. Like, if you have psychic gifts, it's because you're demon possessed, blah, blah, blah. And so, you know, I internalized all these messages very young that any sort of spiritual power or even inclination is evil, and it means you're going to burn in hell forever. Even though I had left the church physically, I guess I hadn't left it mentally. Like, those ideas were still very much informing my self-perception. And so when you are confronted the way that I was with how much power you really do have, not only that, but how much control you have over your own life, over your own experiences, and your own spiritual growth and development, how do you come to terms with that? I spent 10 years giving Arachne credit for making that experience happen, when really it was me all along. And I spent 10 years afraid to tell anyone these details I'm sharing now, because other people are afraid of their own power. And if you start to explain anything about the supernatural, dude, even saying you saw a ghost, people will, like, people act like you're profaning God's name to suggest that there is a spiritual level to reality, to suggest that there's anything other than just the material plane. Like, a lot of people just genuinely don't know, and they've never experienced these things for themselves. And probably the most frustrating thing about spirituality is that it's not like materialistic scientific endeavors where the way to know the truth is to measure and observe and test the outside world. With psychic and spiritual and supernatural phenomenon, the only way to test it is to test it for yourself. Like, a lot of people fall into this trap of, like, waiting for other people to give them a convincing story that will finally make them believe that all of this paranormal stuff is real and worth looking into. And they go around looking for someone else's experience to satisfy their curiosity. And so every ghost story they hear and every psychic encounter they hear and everything like that, none of it's ever going to be good enough for them, because they're not going inward. You know, when we hear this very, like, Eastern concept of, like, go inside to find the truth, that's what they mean. You just cannot understand the spiritual world until you experience it for yourself. Unfortunately, some people are so disconnected from their gift, their psychic perception, that everything I just shared is just gonna sound like a bunch of bullshit to them. And some would say it's pointless for me to even make this video. And quite frankly, I don't necessarily want to convince anyone that the spiritual world exists. I'm talking to people like me who already know, but are not living in their truth, and are repressing it and suppressing it and denying themselves the right to continue exploring. So why am I telling you guys all this? Like I said, I need to be more authentic with myself. I'm spiritual. This is what I care about. I want to know what else is possible. I want to develop these gifts while I still have a chance, you know, instead of wondering for the rest of my life, like, what's good? What's my potential? No one can tell me that but me, and that's up to me, and I will continue to explore that question shamelessly from now on. I realize a lot of what stops people from developing spiritually and exploring these things that fascinate them, like about ghosts, about the paranormal, and the occult, and stuff like that, is just this shame that they're doing something evil and wrong. But you have to recognize that what you think is your own fear of yourself is really other people's fear of themselves that you have internalized. So I don't think I would have been scared to have the gifts that I have if not for the extreme religious upbringing that I had, where everyone else was so scared that everything's demonic that they would shut it down in other people as sort of like a cognitive defense against anything that would threaten their belief system. And once you can recognize that other people's fear is really not your problem, it's one of the most freeing things you can do for yourself. I guess that's it. Thank you for listening. Love you, lovelings.